We kind of knew the game was up, and but we decided beforehand that we didn't want to get stuck in Brussels and become eternal Brussels heads.
No.
Ah nein, ich
We really went back to London. I had a job lined up working for ABCO
No.
for basically my main client was going to be a guy called Victor Van Nestlin, who was the former guy, Khodorkovsky's former partner in Ukraine. You know they were taking Russia to court to try and get money out of it, trying to increase the
Ja, ich sag das dann. Nein, wir machen das zusammen. Hallo.
Then at the 11th hour, one of the recruitment agents I've been working with came back to me and said, "Do you work for Nestle?"
Fantastic.
Let's start.
Sorry.
Okay. No, Mike, I'll see you after. Yeah, of course. Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Sorry. Guten Abend. Im Namen des Schweizerischen Instituts für Auslandforschung und des Literaturhauses begrüße ich Sie sehr herzlich hier im Haus und im Stream. And now back to English. I'm delighted to have Baroness Catherine Ashton here in Zurich. Warm welcome.
Thank you.
My name is Gesa Schneider. I'm the director of Literaturhaus, and I have the honor to be hosting the conversation tonight. And we don't have the opportunity very often to hear firsthand of the inner workings of international or global diplomacy. There is a unique chance for us to learn more about how these discussions and conversations are being had, and also what is at stance right now. We're coming to that later. Catherine Ashton was the first High Representative of Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. That was the official title.
Half the official title. I also had first vice president of the European Commission. So we got rid of all that, and it was HRVP.
HRVP.
Yeah.
And everybody knew what it meant?
I don't know. But the people that mattered did. Or they would call me foreign policy chief in the press. Occasionally foreign minister, which used to annoy the member states of the European Union, particularly then the British, of course, who didn't want anyone that could be called foreign minister, particularly a Brit.
Why is that?
I think because in the new structures that we were setting up, there were many countries who felt very passionately that this was a job that worked for the member states and for the Commission. It wasn't something that sat above it. And titles matter in these circumstances. So although I joke about it, actually it was quite important to some of them that it was seen to be a job that was a representative, that it was about foreign and security policy, that it was also a Commission job. So I was 50% member states, if you like, the Council, 50% the Commission. And so it sat sort of alongside them, or maybe underneath them, but didn't sit above them.
And before that, you were European Union's first female commissioner for trade, and after leaving office, you became the first female chancellor of Warwick University, so a lot of firsts. And you are a chair of advisory council of the Institute for Global Negotiation, based here in Zurich, and also a consultant to the Geneva-based Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, Geneva, which you know quite well. We will talk about at least the interior of hotels, right?
That's right. A lot of hotels. I know very well.
I would like to thank my friend Martin Meyer, president of the executive board of the Swiss Institute for International Studies, for our long time collaboration. 4 times a year we invite important contemporary thinkers who take into account the world, how it was, how it is, how it could be. We invited Anne Applebaum, Jill Lepore, Elida Assmann, to name only a few, and now you, which is great. And also perhaps on a more to say where we are here at Museumsgesellschaft. Lenin was a member in this place. Trotsky was a member. So we are in a strange proximity to the bigger currents of history. And now we are talking about this book, your book, and then what wonderful title, we will come to that later, Inside Stories of the 21st century diplomacy, and it's a fascinating and gripping read and a glimpse into a world that is usually sealed to us, and as we only mostly see the results of negotiations and not really the process. So I'm not a politician, I'm at core a literature person, so we will focus on the stories you tell in the book. And my first question was why this title and not foreign minister. We already talked about that. Was there a moment in the last years where you knew you wanted to write a book about what you experienced from 2009 to 2014? That was the period where you were in office.
I should say formally, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you all for coming, and I'm sorry that this has to be in English, but Michael Jennings is sitting on the front row. He was one of the key staff members who worked with me, and he occasionally attempted to teach me German. But I always seemed to be on a plane going somewhere, so it was pretty difficult. But it's wonderful to see him as well. So thank you. The book comes from, as you will know, because I know you've read it, that when I came home from some of the incredible events that were going on around the world, whether it was the demonstrations in what we call the Arab Spring, whether it was what was happening in Ukraine, whether it was the Iran negotiations or the Serbia-Kosovo talks, or earthquakes and disasters that I'd visited, my husband used to say to me, you know, you should write this down. And I would say, no, nobody's going to be interested. So he taped me. He would sit down and have conversations. He's a journalist. And once a journalist, always a journalist. He sat down with a tape recorder and we would just talk. And when I left office after 5 years, he handed me the tape. You're all old enough to remember tapes, I think. And
there were real tapes.
Real tapes.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, real tapes.
Oh,
sorry,
wow.
real tape.
Okay.
And
I thought it was a metaphor.
No, because how quickly it was 2014. How quickly we just put your phone on that. And he said, over to you. And I ignored them for a long time, and then I transcribed them. I typed them up because I was interested to know what had happened. You forget so much. And indeed, I found that a lot of the details I had forgotten. And as I typed them, I started to think it would be interesting as part of history to have my view of what was going on. I'm not a diplomat. I never wanted to be a politician. I have never stood for election. And yet I have found myself playing those roles, especially in the context of foreign policy. So it's a book that I want you to come with me into the room. It's not written for people who understand in great detail how foreign policy works. This is about the practice when you get a group of people in a room and give them a problem to solve, and how difficult it can be, how the relationships matter, what's going on, and the colour that you don't get from reading a press story. And eventually, when I'd found that people kept asking me about particular stories, I decided that I would see if anyone would be willing to publish it. And here we are.
Well, it's also, I was wondering, listen to you talking with one thing, how can you learn these sort of rules of interaction? And then I was thinking, okay, it's a lot about communication. And I remembered you write in your book that you weren't informed directly. I mean, the chain of information was sort of intertwined or mixed because you learned it through the press, right?
That I got the job.
Yes.
Yeah, that happened to me a couple of times, which are in the book. So the job that I was doing at the time was leader of the House of Lords, so leader of the unelected chamber. And I found one Friday morning that my phone kept ringing, and it was a BBC journalist. Well, the House of Lords is not that interesting. So I couldn't work out why the journalist was ringing. And I got home to see on the television screen my name going around the bottom because the then commissioner, Peter Mandelson, was coming home, and I apparently was going to Brussels. But nobody rang me. So all I could see was the television screen for hours. People kept texting saying, "Oh, are you going to Brussels?" I don't know. And eventually the Prime Minister then, Gordon Brown, rang because somehow they'd mixed up. They didn't seem to realise that there had to be a formal telephone call. So
you had to tell him, right?
Yeah, they had to tell me. And so at 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock I was at home, 2 o'clock I was in my office, and at 7 o'clock I was in Brussels. And that's where I was for the next 6 years.
And can you tell us a bit more about, I have this image of the Brussels situation as a sort of a beehive. Does it work like that? Or how is this like, or Kafka, small little offices everywhere? Or how is the an average day in the beginning?
It's an interesting organization, the EU, because you bring, in those days, 27 and then 28, because Croatia joined, and now back to 27 because the UK left. But you bring the cultures of all of these countries together, and you create institutions that allow for the fact that they are made up of different countries, different ideas, different ways of working sometimes, and you sort of bring it together. So when people talk about it being bureaucratic, which is often the word that is used, in some ways it has to be based on the kind of rules of procedure, because otherwise you would have chaos, because you'd have all of these different ways of working coming together in a form that didn't work. Having said that, sometimes it could be a bit of a challenge to create a new institution. It was the first institution for 50 years. And as well as doing all the job, I had to take responsibility for bringing people from across Brussels, from across the member states, into a new institution that was a diplomatic service that hadn't existed before. I don't know if Michael remembers, but we once spent an afternoon, and you were very central to this, in designing the logo. Do you remember? Because we hadn't got any money. So we had to work out how to kind of present the External Action Service, as it was called, as a new thing. And when you create something new, it's always a challenge to make it accepted. And my way of making it accepted was I created the first food court in Brussels. Food court, where you go and you buy pizza here or salad here or whatever here. And that didn't exist. And people said, no, you can't have a food court. Well, that's what I want, is a food court. And the reason was, it was a nicer way for people to have lunch, but it also meant that people from the other buildings would be interested in coming in to our building. So you'd get them through the door because they'd be keen to see how this worked. And I think it won a prize after I left. I didn't get the prize, but the food court got the prize, which was more important.
Well, that's a wonderful idea, to bring people together and on a small scale to make things work than on a bigger scale. And talking about bigger scale, how did you choose the stories which would find a place in your book? Because I think there must have been many more in the 5 years.
There were lots of places I went to, but we didn't kind of record everything, because that would have been impossible. Sometimes I wasn't at home anyway for quite long periods of time. So I'd been to lots of different countries, seen lots of different events. But I wanted to choose a mixture that demonstrated some of the things that I'd learned in the course of the 5 years. So each story is, I hope within it, you'll start to see the things that I'm trying to say. By being part of what was going on here, this is what I learned. I learned some things about how diplomacy and foreign policy work and what success can look like. So I took very deliberately the earthquakes of Haiti and the tsunami and earthquake of Japan and put them together, just so you can see the differences between a poverty-stricken country in deep trouble, as it still is, Haiti, and a very sophisticated country, but still see the dramatic impact that such an event can have. I wanted to go back to the beginning and talk about the biggest issue of 2009, which was piracy off the coast of Somalia, which seems like a very long time ago, but was the #1 issue, and how you have to think differently if you're going to resolve that. And then through the Arab Spring, and of course the big negotiations I was involved in Serbia and Kosovo and in Iran. And then of course Ukraine, which was the final crisis, if you like, that I spent time dealing with before I left office.
There were things I didn't remember that well. For example, specifically Somalia. How did you come up with a solution there, that it was a problem that you had to solve on land and not in the sea?
So the mission that we were given by the United Nations was to support the World Food Programme, particularly, who found that because of the pirates, it was not safe to get the food to the poorest people in the world, as well as 30,000 ships that crossed this huge ocean every year, bringing trade to and from, and how they were deeply affected because pirates would capture ships, hold them for ransom. People were very afraid to be sailors traveling across that part of the ocean. And insurance companies were asking huge amounts to insure the ships. So it was a really difficult problem. But the pirates were often young boys. They were 14 and 15 years old. They had no possibility in a country that had been wrecked by civil war for 20 years. They might, if they were lucky, get $1 a day job, but they were offered $10,000 if they could go out and capture a ship. And they would often be in boats that were not able to survive on the sea. We'd often have to get them out of the water to stop them from drowning. But they were going to continue to take a risk because they saw no other future. And on land, what was going to be important was to create the circumstances where you could protect the coastline, you could protect the sea, and you could offer people real opportunity. So the military people were very clear. The solution does not lie at the sea. We can stop them. We built corridors of ships from European Union countries and others, from India, from China, from countries all over the world who joined us with support from NATO and support from lots of the companies that were organizing the shipping, so that if you stayed in the corridor, you would not be hijacked. But the reality was we could have still be doing that today if we hadn't been able to try and make some inroads into the problems on the land. And the military were the first people who said we can deal with the problem immediately. What we can't do is deal with the real problem, the underlying problem. And thinking about that meant you had to think about everything that was needed in a country that had very little. I went to Mogadishu, which was an unusual thing to do because it was then called the most dangerous place on earth. And I managed to get in on a UN cargo plane. The government controlled 1 square kilometre around the airport. That was it. Everywhere else was chaos. And we went to meet the new president and the elected community leaders, many of whom were these amazing women in Somalia, who had been trying for a decade to get things to work more effectively. And we sat with them for a day while we tried to work out how we could get more support, and then eventually did a big event in Brussels where we brought all of the major agencies to give significant amounts of money, but not just money, to help them campaign. The president had this great slogan, which was "Give up your guns and go to school," to try and get young people back into school. And he needed everything. He needed, how do you run a civil service? How do you start a civil service? How do you create a proper judiciary system? How do you manage schools properly? How do you provide health care for people who have been dominated by terrorists for decades? So a huge amount still to do. But it was a good example of the fact you can't just tackle the problem you see in front of you. You have to look way beyond it, and you have to think long term.
You also, in the case of Libya, what I found I was a bit desperate to read it, is that sometimes leaders just can't make decisions, and then this sort of inertia puts everything at risk. Can you tell us a bit more about what it is, how difficult, how to make decisions, or kind of leadership would be needed?
It's often the case, in my experience, that the effort of becoming a leader means that once people get to be leaders, they sort of stop. They think, oh, did that. They don't think what they are there for. They think it's about them, not about the people that they serve. Even leaders who think about what they want to do and genuinely care about the people that they are serving are nervous and frightened to do things, because real leadership in circumstances that are difficult means you have to be very brave, and you have to risk that you will lose the next election, or that you will lose support in your own party and be got rid of, and that you might spend time doing something really difficult, really challenging and really important for the future of your country, only to find that you lose the election, the next government comes in and just undoes it all. So it's really tough to be a leader in a really difficult set of circumstances. And you don't meet fantastic leadership very often. You meet good leadership quite often. You meet bad leadership often too. So what happened in Libya was a really interesting example, because after Gaddafi went in every possible way, you had the National Transitional Council had come in. This was a group of people who had come together representing different parts of Libya in terms of geography, different expertise, people who'd come back to the country from outside, from exile, who had real knowledge and experience. And when I met them, which was just after the bombing in Benghazi, I flew in to see them. They were as good a group of people as you might wish to find in terms of a government that you could immediately put into action. Of course, eventually you want an elected government, but in terms of a fairly representative group that could get on with it, this was it. But when they took power, they almost became paralyzed. They were not able to make decisions. And Libya had become full of guns, awash with guns everywhere. It had been a country where Gaddafi had never allowed people to have guns, and suddenly they were everywhere. It had mercenaries who had come across the border. Its borders were open. People were coming in and out. Inevitably, you get organized crime, all of the things that happen when a country is in turmoil. And we wanted to put in border management people to help them secure the borders. We wanted to help them with the police force training to be able to stop the guns. We wanted to help them with the supplies that needed to be got out to get the industry going. This was a very, very rich country. It did not need aid. It just needed its industry to start working again. And we could not get an answer. And the UN were in the same position. And I've read books from colleagues in the United States who talk about the same problem. So we would go and see them, and they would be unable to say yes. And you can't send police and customs people into a country without permission. It's called an invasion, you know. You can't do that. And they needed protecting anyway, because this was a country that was in a degree of turmoil. And that was one of the great tragedies. And it was a really interesting example, because these, again, were people who were terrific and very capable, but felt they didn't have the legitimacy to be able to make the decisions. And it's one, but only one, of the reasons why Libya then spiraled into chaos.
A better example, or on a positive side, is the Kosovo-Serbia, where you were deeply invested in the negotiations, and where in the end it sort of, the small things sort of worked out. On a very small scale, something happened that changed everything in 2013. Can you tell us about the main figures that were involved there?
When people ask me about what it's like to negotiate or mediate, one of the things that I think is really important is the thing that you can't write down, but you can feel. And if I'm ever asked what the most important skill of a negotiator is, I say to listen. Because you're listening not just for the information you need, you're learning about the position that each party holds and why. You get to hear their version of events. And you're also listening for the moment when you see an opportunity. And it can be in a word, it can be in a way that they say something, it can be in a laugh, it can be something that makes you think, hello, we might be able to do something here. When we brought the two prime ministers of Serbia and Kosovo together, they were the same age and they had never met, despite living miles away, only a few kilometers from each other. And they came into my office on a Friday afternoon for one meeting to begin with that was going to last exactly 1 hour. They came with a translator each, and I sat with a wonderful diplomat called Fernando Gentilini, an Italian who was respected across the region that they came from, and without whom it would never have succeeded. And the 6 of us sat in this room. And in the course of that hour, I saw the opportunity, because they started a conversation. Instead of just reading or saying their positions, which is what often happens in meetings, they actually started to talk to each other. And I stopped the meeting after an hour. Famously, actually, as it turned out, they were going to go back in history on technology again because I had one photograph taken and they took out the memory stick. Do you remember memory sticks? And gave it to me. And I said, this photograph goes nowhere unless you both agree, because they were both in a lot of trouble for having even sat in the same room. They were in a lot of trouble at home. And the next day, they allowed me to put out the picture. And I sent it out on the wire, so probably, Michael, you probably did. And it went everywhere. And State Department in the US sent me copies of newspapers where it had hit the front page from Pakistan, Sierra Leone, all kinds of places where you wouldn't think this would be top of the agenda, but so unusual was it. And in the hour, at the end of the hour, I said, I'd like you to go back for dinner. Both agreed and did. And I described all of the crazy things that happened, the arguments about one word.
This is, yes, exactly. So I was thinking we could, before we go to Russia and Ukraine, we could quickly talk about this, the Iranian nuclear deal, which took place in Geneva. And first of all, how do we have to visualize it? So it's been a while. How is coming together? Can you tell us about it?
So around the cycle, you will either have or the E3+3. It's 6. And in the book, I just call it the 6. And it began with 3 European countries, France, Britain, and Germany, trying to have a dialogue with Iran about its nuclear program way back. And then the other permanent members of the Security Council, Russia, China, United States, joining and then becoming P5, permanent 5+1, i.e. Germany, or the E3, the 3 European countries plus the 3 other permanent members. I had spent over 2 years trying to negotiate with the Ahmadinejad government in Iran, which was not easy. And then Rouhani became president of Iran, and I say it was like night to day. It was completely different, and it was clear there was a great interest in trying to find an agreement. We had been traveling, a traveling circus under the Ahmadinejad regime, from Moscow to Almaty in Kazakhstan, to Baghdad, to all kinds of venues. But the first great thing about the Rouhani group was they were very happy to go to one place as long as it was a UN-based place, and we chose Geneva. So the interim agreement, the first agreement, which is what I describe in the book, was done in Geneva, in the Intercontinental Hotel. And the reason for the hotel was that it was easier to move around and to have the informal conversations than using the UN building, which is where we would open every session when we met with a formal meeting at the UN, and the press would come and take pictures, and then we'd all go to the hotel and stay there for days on end, literally days, if not weeks on end, to try and get an agreement. And over the course of October and November of 2013, so in a very short space of time, we managed to get to an interim agreement. But the story I tell in there is also about back channels and the role of the United States, and trying to merge the back channel discussion into the mainstream discussion when you've got countries that weren't aware of what was going on, which is quite a challenge. And then to show you how the detail of the negotiation works, but hopefully in ways that make it interesting.
So we're going to hear a little passage from that negotiation part in Geneva, but just before, in order to understand. So there were all these talks happening, and then you learned that actually the US had different talks going on at the same time, and as they were the US, they were more important than the other talks. Or how was it? How should I describe this?
So I'll let you find the right bit.
Yeah, I have to find the right page.
She chose the bit, so just to find it. So the other 5 countries, France, Germany, Britain, China, and Russia, were all able to have conversations with Iran all the time. They could go and visit Tehran, the Iranians could come to visit them. They could discuss what was going on in the talks or anything else without any difficulty. But the Americans couldn't, because the relationship between Iran and America was such that it was impossible. It would be impossible for the Iranians to be seen publicly with the Americans, and vice versa. So the only way that they could carry on their discussions was to do it quietly, secretly, really. And they began that as we moved towards this phase that I describe in the book. It had to be secret, because otherwise they couldn't do it. But there were consequences for that. It was then difficult to kind of bring it into the light. And it's one of the challenges, I think, in negotiation, when you think about doing back channels, is that eventually they've got to become the front. And you've got to get people up to speed and bring them with you in quite a short period of time. And that was quite a complicated thing to do, because the other 5 did not know. I did not know. I guessed. I thought they might be, but I didn't know, and I didn't want to know. Because, of course, when it became obvious, the first question I was asked by the other 5, because I was chairing the negotiations, was, did you know? And I could say no. And that was important for me. And what the Americans had done was terrific. It was really good work. It just needed to be brought in. And so the particular story of how we did the interim agreement also includes how we brought all of their physically their document to be the document from which we all worked. And we did it.
And this
But
is
this
a
is a little
passage
bit
about
of-
the document, among other.
So this just is a little bit about what I was doing. So I found John Kerry, the Secretary of State for the United States, sitting in his room eating spaghetti while on the phone to William Hague, the UK Foreign Minister. As he ate, I talked him through my conversations with Zarif, the Iranian Foreign Minister. Some upset was inevitable once we started firming up the specifics, but Zarif was angry about the new amendments. John Kerry listened carefully. He understood that the United States talks had caused some anguish, but getting a deal was the priority. I nodded. Everybody understood that. No matter how bruised they might feel, nobody was going to let a bad process get in the way of a good result. Not for the last time. I acknowledged that the document was a great piece of work. We just had to finish it. By now it was late evening, and I convened a meeting of the 6 for 11 o'clock. Everyone was tired and fed up with hanging around for hours. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, unhelpfully wanted to know why the language in the text used was American English. I told him to blame Apple and Microsoft. He waved the paper in the air, saying it was American-sized foolscap paper, a not so subtle way of saying this was an American operation. John Kerry then produced another November the 9th text, where the US had clarified in it some of their sanctions relief, which meant the Iranians had the wrong text, and probably so did I. Helga Schmidt, the political director, looked as if she could throttle someone, mirroring my thoughts clearly. The German foreign minister was furious for a moment, saying this was absolutely no way to run things. I was tired enough to say this was how negotiations were. Hours of detailed work and even more hours of hanging around, bored and not sleeping. He smiled at me and I smiled back as our mutual frustration disappeared. Then he suggested asking the Iranians to join us, and I agreed. If Zarif was prepared to come and explain his position, we had a chance to get the negotiations back on track. Zarif was waiting for me when I got to his room and readily accepted the invitation. I told him I hoped he'd be as candid with them as he'd been with me. I need not have worried.
Thank you very much. So you also talk, before we talk about Ukraine, Russia, Lavrov, who was on the media quite recently, what do you mean by deep democracy? You often talk about that. What is it and how can we implement it?
So particularly in what we call the Arab Spring, they don't call it spring in the Arab world because spring is full of sandstorms and dust and hot winds. It's not a pleasant time of year necessarily. And it's kind of one of the interesting things that we impose what we think in terms of the imagery on somewhere else. But particularly there, but not only there, when we saw these dramatic events and changes ripple across parts of the Arab world and become a real storm in Egypt, what you hear is the cry for democracy and freedom and the cry to have elections. And I started to talk a lot to particularly young people, about the fact that they had to understand that democracy was not just an election. The election is a cherry on the icing on the cake. Because if you elect someone in a corrupt system, it's not an election, really. If you don't know who to vote for because political people or parties can't operate, then it doesn't give you real choice. If you don't have civil society and a police force that works for you, and judges who will be impartial and will look at the election properly, and you don't have monitoring, and you don't have places to go and vote, then it's not really a democracy. And the importance of what I call deep democracy is that you build the institutions as well. You build the framework, the underpinning that's woven together like a basket of weaving that allows you to have real democracy that will last you and will survive whatever happens, because elections move things around. And it will also make sure that when someone is elected, that they leave office at some point because you have chosen someone else. Too often I've seen leaders get into office and then make sure that nobody else can. Either they lock them up, if they're lucky they lock them up, or they rig or change the election system so it's harder for some people to vote. So it's about all of those other things, and I call it deep democracy because it has to go deep. It's roots of a tree, so that when things dramatically change or even change a little, the tree sways but it doesn't break, and you have a chance to continue with democracy. I also used to say the most important thing about an election is throwing a government out. Thank you very much, go away. Very important.
Could it be, I mean, how do you deal with this subtle thing that you shouldn't, you always say also in your book, it's your project, it's your work, you have to do the work. We are just some sort of, we are participating, we are on the sidelines, but we are not actors. How do you make this difference between you are you own your destiny, but we are still there facilitating it, or could it be considered then neo-colonialism? I don't know.
So I never went anywhere unless I was asked to go. We didn't do any of the negotiations or talks without being asked to do them by the people there, because it's their country, not mine. What I would say to them all was, I come from a continent that has managed to kill itself and each other over centuries, and we don't do that anymore, leaving aside what's happened in Russia and Ukraine. If you take the European Union and the countries like Switzerland and the UK and Norway, we do things by negotiation and discussion across a table, and we've learned how to do it. It's difficult. There are lots of arguments. They're often very public, but somehow we move towards decisions together. And we come from value base that we hold dear to ourselves in what we believe in. But it's taken us a long time to get there. And we have some lessons, we have some things we've learned on the way. So what we're offering is our willingness to help, that we've got some things that we can help with. Sometimes that's about money and resources. Sometimes that's about investment. Sometimes that's about how to do things, and always, always in support of the people. So it's not about imposing yourself. It's not something I would ever want to do, but it's not about that. it is about saying firmly and directly what you think. And it is about being very firm and clear with those who do not see their job as being about supporting or protecting their people. And it is about sanctions, and it is about using soft power or economic hard power in the case of Europe. And it is about being prepared to do things when it's necessary. But mainly it's about saying, we are here to try and help and support you.
You said being firm and clear. Can you be firm and clear with somebody like Putin? How is he? You met him a couple of times, and I was thinking there's a theory of 6 degrees of separation, that each of us is separated by 6 persons from another in the world, but it's suddenly very uncanny to realize that I am, thanks to you, or there's only 1 degree of separation left.
That's a bit unnerving. I met President Putin 15, 20, quite a lot of times, because we had regular summits with Russia every 6 months in the EU, and I attended them all for 6 years, as it turned out, because of the trade role, and then met him in other contexts. And, you know, he is somebody who has a very clear view of what he believes his country should be and its position in the world. He does not view Europe and certainly the European Union, as something that he thinks is a good thing. And he believes very firmly in, I think, a combination of history and legacy. He believes that countries, particularly Ukraine, have a long history and are either part of or as close to Russia as possible. And he believes that his legacy is to make sure that what he sees as forces that would move Ukraine or any others away from Russia do not prevail. And that is what drives him. So he's not giving up, because he sees this as exceptionally important to his view of his country and of his view of the world. And to deal with him is to see somebody who doesn't look different from how you see him on TV. You know, some people do look different. He doesn't. He is what you would expect him to look like. He's very clearly, in a room full of people, somebody who is in charge without doing very much. That is very obvious, in the way that you can sometimes go to a meeting and see the person who's going to be leading the meeting by the way that they are and the way other people are with them. And he's someone who is very clear with you about what his expectations are in any relationship. I think I say in the book that I always felt that he would talk to the EU as long as he thought it was useful for him, not in order to develop a stronger long-term relationship, but much more about, is this worth doing? Well, it might be, so I'll keep doing it, but when it isn't, I won't. I think that's how I would describe him.
Did you see, I mean, the question lots of people ask is, and especially also after reading your chapter on the Ukraine in the book, did you see it coming, or can you explain a bit how the crisis, from your point of view, came together in 2014, and if we should have done things differently or be more observant?
Hindsight is always the best vision. But I've thought about that a lot and talked to a lot of people who were around at that time, because the negotiations were with the European Union that started all of this, if you like, were about an association agreement that was trade plus. It was about opportunities for Ukraine to have strong trade and other links with the European Union. And it had been being negotiated for 7 years. It wasn't that Russia didn't know about it. They had known about it, and they had not raised it at any of the summits that I had attended as being an issue. And I've checked this with other people at the summit to make sure I've just not forgotten, But no, nobody remembers it being a big issue. The only person that raised it was the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, who came to a lunch of the Foreign Affairs Council of the EU and who talked then about how it ought to be a trilateral, Russia, Ukraine and EU discussion, not just between Ukraine and the EU. To which the answer is Ukraine is a sovereign state. If it wishes to do something differently, that's up to Ukraine, but we are negotiating with them. And the decision by the then president, Yanukovych, not to sign the agreement, despite it being finished and initialed, he wouldn't sign it. And then later, the spiraling of the Maidan demonstrations that eventually led to him leaving the country and then replacing him with a properly elected president in the shape of Petro Poroshenko, and then, of course, with President Zelensky. And in that time, there is no question in my mind that there was nothing that suggested that Russia would do what it did by taking Crimea and going into the Donbass. Having done that, in fact, I was in Kyiv just before we all went into lockdown from the pandemic. There was a sense that there was no reconciliation going on, but I did not expect him to do what he did. I mean, I saw the troop build up. I listened to the American intelligence, which was very open. And actually the CIA director, Bill Burns, is one of the people in the book, because he was one of the chief negotiators for the Americans on the Iran deal. But I didn't think they would do what they did. And if you talk to people who are Russian but are not, but look at it from a Russian perspective, and I've managed to do that a couple of times, they see it as something that was inevitable, and they decided to choose when they were going to have this conflict. And that they see that this country, Ukraine, has been taken by people who are anti-Russian at best, and if you like, extreme at worst, and that this is not in the interests of the people of Ukraine. They are very clear. It's like looking through a looking glass, a mirror. They see what you see, but they see exactly the opposite of what you see.
That's what you describe in the book as well, talking about Lavrov.
Yeah.
And he sees exactly the same, but he's doing a totally different analysis. Would you say that when he appeared in this Indian conference last week, where people were laughing because he said that Russia was being aggressed, do you think he was candid, or?
I mean, I've heard him not long ago. I talked to him not long ago about he was at something I was at, and yeah, I mean, but this is what he said in 2014. I went to see him, just him and me, talking, and he said what he's saying now, that this is not the Ukraine that they believe Ukraine should be, and that they think this is something they have to deal with in order to defend Russia, I suppose, or in order to prevent Ukraine moving in a different direction. And it's from our point of view, that's just not at all what it is. This is a choice of the people of Ukraine, just as their leaders were their choice in their elections. But that's not what they see, or what they choose to see, which is probably worse.
If they choose to see that, is there a slightest chance to resolve this by negotiation? Because there are talks that there are secret talks happening, or that it will be back to that they will be back around a table at some point.
Well, even if Ukraine wins everything, you still have to have negotiations, because there'll be lots of things to sort out. If they took back Crimea, you have lots of Russians living in Crimea. What are we going to do with them? Do they go home? What happens? What about the people from Ukraine who've disappeared into Russia? What about rebuilding? What about security and borders? So even in the most successful outcomes, there are negotiations that have to take place. And my view is that you can spend an awful lot of time in negotiation arguing about things that don't matter. I have argued about where we should meet, who sits where, whether the flags should be here, whether there should be flags at all, what we should do. You can argue about all those things. So I think beginning to think about the process of negotiation is really important for Ukraine. They must lead. It's not for us to tell them what to do. But just beginning to think who should be in the room. United States, NATO, China, who? Who's going to have this conversation? Because whatever the outcome, and outcomes are often messy, they're not perfect. You end up with having to accept some things that might not be perfect. I hope not, but you don't know. Whatever you're doing, in order to look at the future, Ukraine needs to be secure for decades, if not centuries. It has to be absolutely confident that what is put in place means it's a secure nation. And that is a complicated set of things to do, because it's not just about negotiating with whatever's going on in Russia and whoever the leader or whatever has happened there. It's also about making sure that the people who are going to help you are also signed up to it. In the Iran negotiations, there were 6 countries. Part of my job was to help them get to a common position, because what was really important was that everybody stuck to the same position. Even though some countries might have wanted less or settled for less, the position had to be that every one of the 6 was satisfied. And if they weren't, there was no deal. And we didn't want breakaways from that. And everybody stuck together. Bear in mind that the Iran negotiations were also going on when the Ukraine crisis began. So I was going from Vienna, where we did the second set of negotiations, the final agreement, to Kyiv and back again. And in Vienna, the Russians were our partners, and in Kyiv, they most certainly were not. So you also get all kinds of strange compartmentalizations. So all I'm saying is for Ukraine to decide, not for us. It is our job to help and support them, and to start thinking about, well, where would the talks be? So that if things change, and sometimes they change quite rapidly, you're able to move into that process with Ukraine comfortable about where it is and some sense that this might work.
Thank you so much, Catherine Ashton. I think we have time for questions from the audience. I think it's a good moment to open the discussion on this topic or others. And I don't see... there is one. Thank you.
It's always the microphones.
Yes, it's always a problem with microphones.
Hello.
But give it perhaps to the technical person. He can help you. Okay.
It's lit up now, so
Okay.
Thank you very much for the talk, Lady Ashton, right? Should I?
Kathy, please call me Kathy. I don't.
Kathy. Can I ask, from your personal perspective, but also taking, of course, into consideration all your experience, but speaking as a private person, to what extent you would say that the war and the tragedies that are happening in Ukraine are fault and or responsibility of individual Russian citizens?
It's very difficult to answer that, because what we know is that for many years, people in Russia have been fed information of one particular kind. And we have all experienced in our countries now the situation where if people simply only listen to one set of voices, they don't get all of the information. Sometimes they get none of the information that is really necessary. So you can't assume that people are well informed or indeed can think about the situation except through one way of looking through the mirror. So in the context of who is responsible, it is the leadership of Russia who are responsible. And one day, somewhere down the track, we need to work out as Europeans what our relationship was going to be with this huge population in Russia of a kind that will eventually, not under this leadership, but eventually perhaps lead us to have stronger and better relations. In the EU, we always tried to work for people-to-people discussions to enable a broader conversation and a greater understanding to come forward. So I'm always hesitant when you know people have just been fed a diet of particular information to say it's somehow their fault.
Another question just there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the insights thus far. Negotiation process I am following currently quite closely is the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO. And I have a personal connection to those countries. But something that I find quite disturbing, and I would like to hear your thoughts on it, is the narrative of like, the moment Turkey and Hungary accept the two countries, or at least one of them, being Finland, it will all be good. And then I find this narrative quite short-sighted, because then you're inside a club with two countries who have used, one could say, very nasty ways of getting their way and influencing the politics of different nations, and also calling to question some very fundamental principles of, let's say, the EU and NATO. And then while you were talking about kind of the culture of coming around one table and having discussions and dialogues, for me, when kind of with the current situation, I do not see that it's as rosy, or somehow I see huge issues there and even backsliding. So my question would just be your reflections on this negotiation.
So when I was in office, I used to joke that there was always an election going on somewhere in the EU. And you would get very different governments. You would get governments that were easy to work with, and ministers who were very comfortable with their role. You would get very strange coalitions, where I would get the foreign minister, who the prime minister had sent to be foreign minister to get them away. You would get governments where their politics was so different from anything I would like that it was very challenging. It's never easy. It's if you put that many nations either around the NATO table, and I used to attend all of the NATO foreign and defence minister meetings, or you put them around the EU, it's not harmony, it's not simple and straightforward. There's always going to be at least one, if you're lucky, 2, 3, if you're unlucky, countries who do not really share all of the ideals of many of the others. And that's the job. The job for the EU and the job for NATO is to manage that situation, because eventually they are still democracies, it will change, but you may get it somewhere else, and to make it clear that they must abide by the values and ideals of the organizations. You are absolutely right to point to what's happening is that individual nations pressure because it's a unanimity vote. But they will come in because actually in the end the interests to get them inside NATO will be paramount. And there's a lot of posturing goes on. And it's not just these two countries. I've seen it happen in all sorts of circumstances in the EU on something completely different. It'll be countries you wouldn't expect to do that, but they do. They go, oh, well, I'm not voting for that unless you do this. There's a lot of that trading going on. It's just with Hungary and Turkey, it's very obvious what's going on, and it's very obvious what they're trying to do. Should the EU and NATO be a bit tougher? Probably. Probably. But the challenge is to hold it in play, to hold them as part of it, recognizing that if you can get leaders like that to basically move in the right direction, then when things change, it will be even better because you'll have leaders who will automatically do it. But it'll be good when they're in.
There's another question over there.
So these were two rather difficult questions, so I think it's time for an easy question.
Oh, please.
I just read, sorry to start with that, I just read that you were criticized because of your language skills. it's English and a little bit of French. Now, doing the job for so long and being partially quite successful, so it's obviously not the point of establishing...
You're flattering me far too much.
Right, my point is coming, my point is coming. So establishing a good relationship via languages and getting close to each other via languages, it seems not to be the key of success. But you were able to establish good contacts with the parties. So what is the key to success if it's not the language?
I wasn't just criticised for that, by the way. I was criticised for everything. and I used to say it was rather like when you read a book and you have in your mind what the character looks like, and then you see the movie, the film, and they don't look like that, and you're disappointed. Well, I was the disappointment. I was British, I was a woman, I was everything that they didn't like. So language was not half it. And the truth was that my languages got worse because a lot of the time I was not in Europe. I was talking to people all over the world, and for many of them, their second language was English. Or in the case of the Americans, vaguely English. So, you know, you were often with people who'd been educated in America or in Britain or Australia News. It just was, interestingly, more common than you might imagine that I didn't notice that I was working, that I was still in my own language, and so were they. So I didn't have the problem in the work that I was doing in the same way that I felt it when I was part of the discussions inside. But then, of course, a lot of the countries of the 28, English was their second language, not French or German. So again, you had quite a strong English dominance in many of the meetings. But to get to your point, it is about language, but it's often about the way that the language is spoken. So you know when whatever language you're being spoken to, whether someone's shouting at you or being hostile or being challenging, even if you've not yet had the translation. And you also know if they're being warm and friendly and so on. And so you often don't actually need the words, it's about the atmosphere. It certainly helps if it's the same language. And when the Iranian team changed, we moved from translating everything to English because we discovered they all spoke English anyway, which the ones who kind of carried on we didn't know. And the new team coming in did because they'd been educated or had lived and worked in usually the US, occasionally Britain. So it does play its part, but it's actually the thing you hear, not necessarily the words spoken.
So one last question. Oh, there's one behind. Let's say two. First here in front, and then in the back. Oh, sorry, I haven't seen that you were in the dark. Go ahead. We've changed the order.
Yeah.
No, thank you. Obviously, I think there is no answer to it, but where we are afraid of is nuclear war. How realistic is that with a person who is so unpredictable?
I would not be complacent, but I think that the Russians have a real understanding of what the implications of any nuclear weapons being used would be. It is much, for me, I'm more wary of a nuclear weapon appearing somewhere with a country that doesn't have the history of having thought about deterrence and mutual assured destruction and all of the things that came from the Cold War and beyond. So I can't predict anything, but I don't think that it is likely that we will see nuclear weapons being used. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but I think it's unlikely.
And then this way there.
If you look at world actors today, there are certainly very many negative things that you can say about Russia, that you can say about China. What I find interesting, though, definitely you can say they have a plan. If you fast forward 50 years, they would definitely know where they want to be in 50 years. The EU, characteristically, I don't believe they have a plan, and they oftentimes appear also underdetermined in what the own purpose of the EU actually is. You remember that discussion about the finality of the EU, etc., etc. Is that ultimately in these times a strength or a weakness?
Wow. I think the EU has a greater sense of direction than it sometimes kind of lets people know about. It cannot have a finality because it doesn't lie with any one moment or any one group of country leaders at one given time to decide that. It will lie with an eventual way of looking at its position in the world. Not that long ago, Ukraine would probably not have been high on anyone's list as a member for the future. It's there now. The Western Balkans are there now. You have Moldova. You have a different thinking because politics has changed. The world has changed. It will never be the same again. Europe will never be the same again. So it's bound to be a shifting set of ideas. Whereas Russia is one country and China is one country, and they can think longer term because of the nature of the way that they run their countries. They don't have changes of government. They don't have movement in politics. It stays as it is. So you can start to think longer term in terms of what you think as a leader your country should be, not what the people think. Whereas the great thing about Europe is that it is churning and changing, and it's full of people who have ideals and ideas. Not everybody will agree with everything. Not all of them are the best. But democracy works, and it works against still a strong set of values. And it shudders and it shakes and it, they yell at each other and all of that goes on. But as I always say, Brussels is the only place on earth where to fail to reach agreement is against you as an ambassador or as an official. Your job is not to stand behind your country's position for too long. Your job is to find a compromise. And there's no other place on earth where that's true and where you will be seen to have failed if you fail to get an agreement. And that's quite special, really.
Just one last question here in front.
Wait.
If we stay with what you were saying now, that the job is to get an agreement, the job is to do something for the people in Europe. Can you make a few comments around Brexit and what happened on that side? Because I'm pretty sure there were very qualified negotiations, but apparently Brussels didn't manage to convince the UK side to remain, which I think is a great pity.
I thought I'd got away with the Brexit question. The challenge for Britain in Europe was always, in my view, that it was not well understood what being part of the European Union was. Back to if you don't give people information, then how can they make decisions? It's not a subject for a referendum. We have elected representatives. We live in a representative democracy. Parliament should have decided, in my view. And it should not have been that it was just simple majority, because it's far too big and far too complicated. And it wasn't so much that Brussels didn't persuade people, but Brussels is often used as the thing that's bad. When I was a government minister, local government used to blame us and we used to blame Brussels, often for things that we had suggested to Brussels. So if you spend years and years saying that something is not good and there are better ways, and you have charismatic people like Boris Johnson, who is very well liked in the country, I'm just saying, and who go out and say, essentially, you can leave and still have all these lovely things, all these goodies, then why are we surprised if in the end that's what people think could happen? So I don't think Brussels lost Britain. I think Britain failed to persuade people. And I think the future now is about trying to have as strong and good a relationship with Europe as possible. I used to do the negotiations with Switzerland. That was fun.
Oh, we should have talked about that. If only I had known that earlier in the game.
I left it till the end.
That would have been so interesting. But that's for another time, hopefully. Yes. Perhaps just one sentence. Why is your book called And Then What? Because I said that in the beginning.
Because, and again, I don't know if Michael remember this, because it was a thing I started to say a lot when we would meet with officials and they would say, we think you should do this or whatever. And my interest was always is, and then what? You know, what happens next? What do we do afterwards? And as I started to put the book together, I wasn't going to call it And Then What? I hadn't thought of a name. And people who started to read bits of it said, you've got to call it And Then What? Because it absolutely sums up what you're trying to say, which is we have to think much longer term than we do if we're going to solve some of the problems that we have. Why do we think that one generation of girls going to school will change hundreds of years of views in communities that they shouldn't? Why do we think we can turn problems that have taken decades to arise, turn them round in 6 months or a year? It's always got to be and then what? And everything that we do in diplomacy and foreign policy, which is all about domestic stuff, it's about keeping you safe, keeping control of borders, keeping opportunities for young people to travel, for you to go on your holidays, for all of these things, developing the economy, all of it is foreign policy, which means it's all domestic. And doing that, you always have to have in your mind whatever's going on, and then what?
Catherine Ashton, thank you so much for being here
Pleasure.
tonight with us at Literaturhaus.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So it was a huge pleasure and honor to have you here. You will be able, thank you all for being here tonight as well. You will be able to buy the book and you gracefully agreed to sign it. Our next event together with the Schweizerisches Institut für Auslandforschung will be on May 15th with the Ukrainian author and essayist Tanya Malyarchuk. She will be in conversation with Martin Meyer. And now I wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you again and have a good night. Thank you. That went well. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure.
And thank you for being so...
Tschüss, ja, ich bin auch sehr glücklich.